Sometimes what trips us up the most in our life isn't outside us. It's not the economy or a difficult person in the workplace. It's not the president, and it's not even the devil. It's an inner tangle, a knot in your soul, or a hidden emotional trigger that we didn't even know was there. Carl Jung called these complexes. They aren't just bad moods or passing irritations. They are deeply rooted emotional constellations that pull us into the past while we're standing in the present. And if we can learn to see them, they can become a doorway to healing, to self-knowledge, and for the believer to the sanctifying presence of Christ. Today, we're going to step into that doorway. It's time to awaken holy wonder. Stay with me. Welcome to the Christian Jung. I'm Meer. I'm a PhD theology student with 2 advanced degrees in Carl Jung's psychology. In my own longing for a deeply transformative Christian experience, I found that the psychologist Carl Jung had already provided us with tools that are deeply biblical and aligned with the Christian faith. The rich spiritual tradition that we inherited from the Celtic saints, the Desert Fathers, and the Book of Acts is available for us today. Let's journey together as we discover the spirit in Christianity and water the dry, aching areas of our soul. In Jungian psychology, a complex is an emotionally charged cluster of memories, feelings, and associations, all orbiting around a central theme. They're like bundles of meaning that live in your unconscious. Let's say the theme is authority. Every encounter that you've ever had with authority, from your parents to teachers to bosses, get woven together in that complex. And here's the tricky part. When something in the present pokes at that complex, your reaction may not fit the current situation. You might be reacting not just to this authority figure in the present, but to every past authority figure you've ever known. Jung called complexes the royal road to the unconscious. Why? Because you don't have to wait until you're asleep to meet them. They show up in broad daylight, in your tone of voice, in your sudden silence, and in the way you walk out from an opportunity that you secretly wanted. So in the Bible, we are given language for this inner terrain. Paul calls them strongholds in the mind in 2 Corinthians 10, 4-5. And it's the sin that so easily entangles in Hebrews 12, 1. David talks about them too, and he says, "Search me, O God, see if there's any offensive way in me," Psalms 139. These aren't only moral concerns, they are also deep inner patterns that shape our thoughts, emotions, and relationships. Before we go to a break, let's pause for a moment and think about your week. Was there a time this week where you overreacted and even you knew it didn't quite match the situation? Was there a time you should have spoken up about something but stayed silent instead? Did someone's harmless comment feel strangely personal, almost like it was aimed at a tender, unhealed place in you? Those are often the fingerprints of a complex, and I want you to keep one of those in mind as we go through today's episode, because by the end, you might see it in a whole new light. Stay with us. Has something stirred in you today? If the Spirit is whispering beneath the surface of your life, if you feel the fire of transformation but don't know where to go with it, you are not alone. The Christian Jung community is where we reflect, journal, read, and create together. It's not about performing faith, it's about encountering God in the quiet inner places. It's a space for those being transformed, not just mentally informed. With journal prompts, a guided reading club, an archetypal movie library, and a creative corner to help you listen for the voice within, I invite you. But the doors only open a few times each year, and this is one of those times. So if anything in you is stirring, don't wait. Join us now at angelameer.com, where psychology meets spirit and inner work becomes holy work. Say yes to the fire. Visit angelameer.com and walk in community with us. In the early 1900s, Jung was working at a psychiatric clinic in Zurich. He was fascinated by why patients seemed to get stuck on certain emotional themes, why one trigger would trigger anxiety, evasiveness, or strange associations. To explore this, he developed the word association test. It was simple. He'd read a word aloud, like mother or death, and ask the patient to respond with the first word that came to mind. He would time their responses in this, and what he discovered was pretty remarkable. If a word touched on a sensitive theme, the patient might hesitate or give an unrelated answer. They might laugh nervously or repeat the word instead of responding. Even physical signs would show up in this. They would sweat, or there would be changes in breathing, or shifts in their voice tone. The word association tests are actually still used today, and this was thanks to Jung. He realized that these weren't just random quirks. The delayed responses and bodily changes were signs that the word had activated an emotional constellation buried in the unconscious of the person. He called these constellations complexes, and he noticed something astonishing. They could be so strong, they would interrupt a person's conscious train of thought even when they tried to hide it. To Jung, this meant the unconscious wasn't just a dark attic of forgotten memories. It was alive, active, and full of structures that could steer the course of a person's life. Years ago, I had an experience that brought this home to me in a way I'll never forget. I was part of a leadership team, and someone I respected deeply offered me some constructive feedback. Their tone was kind, even encouraging, but inside of me, a storm went off. My heart pounded, my face was flushed, and I found myself justifying and defending myself before I'd even thought about what they had said. Later, I sat before God and asked, what was that? In prayer, I saw that there was flashes of my younger self working really hard to prove that I was capable. I was feeling unseen and striving for approval. That younger self was still inside me, and when my colleague's words touched on that old wound, my complex leapt to my defense before I could think. That day I realized this wasn't just about self-awareness. It was about sanctification. God wasn't condemning me. He was inviting me to let him into that wounded place. The complex became a signal showing me exactly where his healing wanted to go. Here's another example. Think of Jonah. When God calls him to Nineveh, Jonah doesn't just politely decline. He runs in the complete opposite direction. The text doesn't really spell out a psychological profile, but from a Jungian lens, we can imagine that there's a prejudice at work here in Jonah. It's a complex that includes layers of fear, resentment, and cultural bias towards Nineveh. This isn't just rebellion, it's whole emotional constellation rooted in Jonah's identity and history being activated by God's call. Here's another example. I had a friend, a woman I'd call Sarah, who worked in a finance office. Whenever a male supervisor gave her instructions, she'd feel tense and irritable, even if his request was reasonable. After some inner work, she realized these reactions weren't just about her current boss. They were actually echoes of her father, who was controlling and critical. That authority complex was shaping her perception of men in the present. And naming it helped her separate her past from her present and start responding instead of reacting. Jung himself wasn't immune to complexes. In Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, he writes of a time he was sharply criticized by a colleague. The criticism triggered such a strong reaction in him that he knew was disproportionate to the situation. And upon reflection, he realized he had an old wound from early in his medical career, the fear of being dismissed as unqualified. This inadequacy complex still lived in him, and he saw it as an ongoing invitation to examine himself and to bring it into the light, into the consciousness of understanding what to do about it. So what do we do when our complexes are triggered? Well, let's just start with what they kind of look like, okay? They're kind of like emotional clusters. In fact, Jung would say that they are emotionally toned, right? They are very moved by an emotional outburst. It may be joy, it might be unprovoked happiness, or it could be anger, it could be going into silence. And a complex is like a bundle of memories, emotions, and associations just wrapped around this kind of central theme. They're autonomous, and that means that they can actually take over in certain moments without our conscious understanding. So you understand this. This has probably happened to you of, it just comes out of nowhere and you're like, well, that kind of was out of character for me, right? So that is a good tip that a complex may be in what you're dealing with. In Galatians 2, Peter actually deals with a complex. And what happens is he's withdrawing from the Gentile believers because of fear of criticism. This wasn't a reasoned theological decision. It was an old complex because remember, he had that vision about the Gentiles and eating all different types of meat. And, this old complex was actually triggering him back into the religious kind of Jewish mentality, these old behavior patterns that he had kind of shed in order to go and bring the gospel to Gentiles. Complexes often show up also with family members. In fact, I remember once my mom and I were engaging in a very nice conversation, and she said something that tripped up an old complex in me. And before I even knew what was happening, I was yelling at her, and in a way that I hadn't really since I was a teenager. This is why it's important to understand that complexes actually distort our perception of reality. In this way, we don't actually have a clear vision of what's going on in certain scenarios because our complexes are distorting them. And they distort even how we hear God and interpret his leading. So a calling may come, but if a failure complex dominates in your life, you may hear it as an impossible calling. So Moses had this same issue. When Moses was at the burning bush, he resists God's call with the quote, "I am slow of speech." And this isn't God's assessment of Moses. This is Moses responding to God with his complex. And it's his inadequacy that is actually speaking louder than God's divine call into his life. So in Jung's view, naming a complex loosens its grip. In the Christian life, awareness is the starting point, but the Spirit can take us further. We invite Christ to search, cleanse, and rewrite that complex so that we can also have clear perceptions to know what's going on. The Samaritan woman in John chapter 4 carries a complex of shame. Jesus names her reality without condemnation, and she becomes a bold evangelist in her town because she loosens the grip from that shame complex. Every time we get together on these podcasts, I like to have you reflect. So today we're going to take a moment to bring to mind any triggering situation that maybe you thought of earlier in the podcast. Ask the Holy Spirit, what is this connected to? And listen for any memories that might come up, images that might appear in your mind, or emotions that really come up strong. Don't judge yourself in this process. See this as an invitation. In the Christian Jung community, I do have guided processes for identifying complexes, mapping your triggers, and bringing them into prayer using both Jungian tools and biblical healing practices. Membership only opens a few times a year, so I hope I see you at angelameer.com to join us. Next week, we'll explore the shadow, places in us that need Christ's light. But as we end tonight, we always like to sit in silence. Invite the presence of Christ into your complexes. Think of the verse from Psalms 139 that says, "Lord, search me and know me. See if there's any offensive way in me and lead me in the way everlasting." As we end today in this time of quiet, we're going to say a prayer from St. Ephraim the Syrian. O Lord and Master of my life, take from me the spirit of sloth, despair, lust of power, and idle talk. Give rather the spirit of chastity, humility, patience, and love to thy servant. Yea, O Lord and King, grant me to see my own transgressions and not to judge my brother. For blessed art thou unto the age of ages. Amen. This movement is small but sacred. If If you want to help more people walk the way, leaving a review or sharing an episode makes a real difference. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share.